Hi, thank you for joining us once more on Boring History for Sleep. I'm already feeling quite sleepy myself. Hope you are too. If this is your first time here, a special welcome. Consider subscribing if you enjoy this kind of historical drift, and perhaps leave a like if you find yourself drifting peacefully into the past with us. As we dim the lights on the present, breathe deeply, release any tension, and let your mind wander with us into the intriguing, if somewhat unsettling realities of yesteryear. Tonight, we're sliding open the paper doors of feudal Japan to explore a world where the concept of privacy, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent. Imagine living your entire life knowing that every whisper, every movement, every intimate moment might be witnessed or overheard by family members, servants, or even passing strangers. This was the reality for those living in Japanese households during the feudal period, spanning roughly from the 12th to the 19th century. Close your eyes and picture yourself transported to a traditional Japanese home. The first thing you notice is the architecture itself, beautiful, elegant, and utterly betraying of every sound you make. The walls around you aren't walls as you know them. They're shoji, delicate wooden frames covered with translucent paper that slide rather than swing, creating rooms that are less permanent barriers and more temporary suggestions of separate spaces. In the dim light of evening, you can see the shadows of household members moving on the other side, their silhouettes projected like puppets in a shadow play. Every footstep, every cleared throat, every whispered conversation travels unimpeded through these paper membranes. The floor beneath you is covered with tatami mats, woven straw that feels pleasantly cool against your feet but creaks and whispers with each step, announcing your movements to everyone within earshot. The house itself seems alive, a wooden entity that groans and shifts, carrying sounds from one end to the other through its wooden skeleton. There is no escaping this acoustic transparency. It is built into the very fabric of your dwelling. Feel the gentle evening breeze that flows through the house. Unlike Western homes designed to keep nature out, traditional Japanese architecture embraces the outside world, with entire walls that slide open to welcome the seasons. This openness to nature means openness to neighbors as well. Homes in villages and towns are built close together, and the sounds of your neighbors' lives blend with your own in an inescapable symphony of communal existence. As night falls, you prepare for sleep, but not in a private bedroom. The concept of rooms with dedicated functions, bedrooms, dining rooms, living rooms, doesn't exist here. Instead, futon bedding is rolled out in spaces that served other purposes during the day. You might sleep in the same room as your parents, your siblings, your children, or your servants, depending on your status. The gentle breathing of others accompanies you into slumber, their bodies just an arm's length away. This physical proximity extends to every aspect of life. Bathing, often considered one of our most private activities today, was frequently communal. Bodily functions, intimate conversations, arguments, lovemaking, all occurred within this paper-thin environment where true solitude was a rare luxury, if it existed at all. But perhaps most striking is not just the physical lack of privacy, but the social structure that reinforced it. In feudal Japan, the concept of the individual, as we understand it today, was subordinate to the family unit and the broader social hierarchy. Your actions reflected not just on yourself, but on your entire household and lineage. This created a system of mutual surveillance where family members monitored each other's behavior to protect the family reputation, and where servants reported to masters, who reported to lords in an unbroken chain of observation and control. As you settle into this world without secrets, without truly private spaces, without moments entirely your own, you begin to understand that privacy as we cherish it today is not a universal human constant, but a cultural and historical construct. The Japanese feudal household reveals a fundamentally different way of existing, one where the boundaries between self and other, between personal and communal, were drawn in entirely different places than we might expect. Let's explore deeper into this world where paper walls and social structures combine to create a life perpetually lived in the presence of others. Let's focus more closely on the physical reality of the Japanese feudal home, particularly those paper partitions that defined, or rather failed to define, private spaces. The shoji and fusuma that separated rooms were marvels of aesthetic design, but utterly inadequate barriers for anyone seeking genuine privacy. Imagine yourself running your fingers along a shoji screen. Feel the delicate wooden lattice framework beneath the translucent paper. These sliding doors typically separate interior spaces from exterior verandas or gardens. The paper, washi, made from mulberry bark, allows light to filter through, creating that distinctive, soft, diffused illumination so characteristic of traditional Japanese interiors. But this same translucency means that when lit from behind, your silhouette is clearly visible to anyone on the other side. Every movement becomes a shadow play for others to observe. At night, with a lantern or candle lit inside your room, this effect becomes even more pronounced. You become the unwitting performer in a shadow theatre. Undressing, changing positions while sleeping, intimate moments with a spouse, all are projected as shadowy outlines for anyone passing by. You learn to be conscious of your silhouette, to move away from the light source when seeking any semblance of privacy, to exist with the constant awareness of potential observation. The sound transmission through these paper barriers is perhaps even more intrusive than the visual exposure. Speak in anything above a whisper, and your words travel clearly to adjacent rooms. The rustle of clothing, a suppressed cough, even the sound of your breathing, all are audible to those nearby. Conversations held in normal speaking tones might as well be conducted in the same room as your neighbors. There is no such thing as a truly private conversation within these walls. Fusuma, the opaque paper sliding doors used to partition interior spaces, offer slightly more visual privacy than shoji, but their sound insulation properties are equally poor. These panels, decorated with painted landscapes or abstract designs, create the illusion of separate rooms while allowing nearly every sound to pass through unimpeded. The wooden tracks along which both shoji and fusuma slide often develop gaps with age and use, creating additional avenues for sound to travel. The physical structure of the house compounds this acoustic transparency. Traditional Japanese architecture uses a post and beam construction with relatively few solid walls. Sound travels freely through the wooden skeleton of the building, carried along beams and posts like a primitive audio system. A conversation held at one end of the house might be clearly audible at the other end, transmitted through the very bones of the structure. Even the tatami mats beneath your feet contribute to this lack of acoustic privacy. While they might muffle footsteps slightly, they also creak and whisper with movement, announcing your presence and activities. The distinctive sound of tatami, a soft rustling combined with the occasional creak, becomes a constant auditory backdrop to daily life, a soundtrack that maps the movements of every household member. Weather conditions affect these paper boundaries significantly. During humid summers, the paper absorbs moisture, becoming even more translucent and sometimes developing small tears. In winter, the dry air causes the paper to contract and become more brittle, developing tiny cracks that further compromise what little privacy these barriers provide. The seasonal cycle of replacing damaged paper in screens and doors was a regular household maintenance task. For the modern person accustomed to solid walls, doors that lock, and the expectation of acoustic privacy, this environment would be profoundly unsettling. Every sneeze, sigh, argument, or moment of intimacy exists in a semi-public sphere. You would quickly develop what anthropologists studying Japanese culture have called privacy by convention, a social agreement to pretend not to hear or see things that propriety suggests should remain private, even when they are plainly audible or visible. This physical reality shaped behavior in profound ways. Important or sensitive conversations might be held outdoors, away from the house entirely. People learned to speak in hushed tones, to communicate through indirect language and implication rather than explicit statements. The awareness of being perpetually audible and often visible created a form of self-censorship that permeated daily life, a constant consciousness of one's presence as part of a communal acoustic and visual environment, rather than as a truly separate, private individual. Let's explore the physical organization of the Japanese feudal household, where the very concept of dedicated personal space was largely absent. Unlike modern homes with their specialized rooms for specific functions, the traditional Japanese house operated on principles of flexibility and communality that would feel profoundly invasive to contemporary sensibilities. As you move through a typical Japanese home of the feudal period, you notice something striking: the absence of rooms with fixed purposes. That space where you just ate your meal. By evening, it will become your sleeping area. The room where household business is conducted during the day transforms into a sleeping chamber at night. This fluid use of space means that no area truly belongs to any individual. Each room serves multiple functions and is used by multiple people throughout the day and night. The sleeping arrangements perhaps best illustrate this communal approach to living. As night falls, watch as household members bring out the futon bedding from storage closets. These thin mattresses are laid directly on the tatami floor, often side by side with minimal space between them. In a modest family home, you might find parents, children, and perhaps elderly relatives all sleeping in the same room, their bodies separated by mere inches. The sounds of sleep, breathing, snoring, the rustling of bedding as someone turns over, create an intimate nocturnal soundscape shared by all. Even in larger, wealthier households, true sleeping privacy was rare. While the family head might have slightly more separated sleeping arrangements, the concept of the private bedroom simply didn't exist. Servants often slept in hallways or in small, dedicated areas, sometimes on simple mats rather than proper futon. Their presence throughout the house, even during sleeping hours, meant that someone was always nearby, always potentially watching or listening. Meals reinforced this communal existence. Picture the family gathered around a central hearth, irori, in winter, or seated on the tatami around low tables. Food preparation and consumption were visible to all, taking place in open areas rather than segregated kitchens and dining rooms. The sounds and smells of cooking permeated the entire house. Conversations during meals were rarely private affairs, as household members of various statuses would be present, from family members to servants. The genkan, entryway, of the house served as another semi-public space where the boundaries between inside and outside, private and public, blurred. Visitors would be received here, removing their footwear before stepping up onto the raised floor of the main house. This transitional space was neither fully private nor fully public, creating a gradient of privacy rather than a clear boundary. For those of higher status, the reception room, zashiki, might offer a slightly more formal setting for meetings, but even this space was not truly private. Servants might be present or within earshot, and the thin partitions meant that conversations could be overheard from adjacent areas. Important or sensitive discussions often took place outdoors, in gardens where natural sounds provided some acoustic masking and distance from the house offered more confidentiality. Storage in these homes further reinforced the communal nature of living. While personal possessions existed, they were typically minimal and often stored in communal chests or cabinets. The concept of the locked private drawer or cabinet was largely foreign. Your belongings, like your activities, existed in a shared sphere, potentially accessible to others in the household. The toilet facilities, typically simple pit latrines located in a small outbuilding or at the edge of the main structure, offered minimal privacy. Often these spaces had only the most rudimentary partitions, sometimes just a half-height screen. The sounds and smells of bodily functions were difficult to conceal, adding another layer of forced intimacy to daily life. This communal organization of space reflected and reinforced the collective nature of Japanese feudal society. The individual was subordinate to the family unit, and the physical environment embodied this hierarchy of values. Personal space, personal time, and personal activities were concepts with very different boundaries than those we recognize today. Your existence was fundamentally intertwined with others, physically manifested in these shared, fluid, multi-purpose spaces that offered little opportunity for solitude or true privacy. Beyond the physical constraints of paper walls and communal spaces, an equally powerful force shaped the lack of privacy in feudal Japan. The elaborate system of social surveillance and control that permeated every level of society. This invisible web of observation and reporting created a psychological environment where true privacy of thought and action was nearly impossible. In feudal Japan, you exist within a rigid hierarchical structure known as the Shinokosho system, dividing society into four main classes: samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom, with outcasts, or ETA, existing outside this formal structure entirely. This hierarchy wasn't just about social status. It created a comprehensive system of mutual surveillance where those above watched those below, and those below reported on each other. If you're a commoner in a village, you belong to a system called the goningumi, or five-person group. This arrangement binds you and four neighboring households into a mutual responsibility unit. Feel the weight of this connection. If any member of your group breaks the law or fails to pay taxes, all five households are punished collectively. This creates a powerful incentive to monitor your neighbors' activities and report any suspicious behavior. Your neighbors are simultaneously your community support and your prison guards. The village headman, Nanushi, serves as both your representative to higher authorities and their eyes within the community. He maintains detailed records of births, deaths, marriages, crop yields, and potential problems. Nothing escapes documentation. When disputes arise, they're often settled publicly, with the entire village as witness. There is no concept of confidential legal proceedings for most matters affecting commoners. For those living in castle towns or cities, the surveillance becomes even more structured. Neighborhoods are divided into blocks with appointed block leaders who report to ward officials, who report to city magistrates, who ultimately report to the daimyo, feudal lord, or the shogunate. Information flows upward through this hierarchy, creating a comprehensive intelligence network that reaches into every corner of urban life. Travel itself is heavily monitored. At checkpoints, sekisho, along major roads, your identity, destination, and purpose are scrutinized. Without proper documentation, you cannot pass. Innkeepers are required to record details about their guests and report suspicious individuals to authorities. Even your movements between villages might require permission from local officials. Within samurai households, the surveillance is particularly intense. Servants report to senior household members, who report to the samurai master. For higher-ranking samurai, their own activities are closely monitored by their lords. The daimyo themselves are subject to the Sankin Kotai system, requiring them to spend alternate years in Edo, Tokyo, under the watchful eye of the shogun, while leaving their families as virtual hostages when they return to their domains. This creates a society where information constantly flows upward, where loyalty is demonstrated through reporting, and where silence about wrongdoing is itself considered a serious offense. The psychological impact is profound. You develop what scholars call anticipatory compliance, modifying your behavior not just because you're being watched, but because you might be watched at any moment. Religious practices reinforce this surveillance culture. Household Buddhist altars, butsudan, contain tablets representing ancestors who are believed to observe the living. Shinto beliefs suggest that kami, spirits, are present in natural features and objects, witnessing human behavior. Even the dead are watching you. The physical environment of villages and towns enhances this visibility. Houses face onto narrow streets where neighbors can easily observe comings and goings. Agricultural work happens in open fields where everyone can see everyone else. Markets and shops conduct business in plain view. There are few places to hide, few moments truly unwatched. Perhaps most insidious is the internalization of this surveillance. You begin to monitor yourself, to censor your own thoughts and actions, in anticipation of being observed. The boundaries between public performance and private self blur until the distinction almost disappears. Your identity becomes fundamentally social rather than individual, defined by your place in the hierarchy and your relationships with others, rather than by any concept of a private, autonomous self. This system of mutual surveillance wasn't just oppressive, it was remarkably effective at maintaining social order. Crime rates were low, tax collection efficient, and social stability preserved for centuries. But the cost was the near-complete sacrifice of what we would now consider basic privacy rights. Your actions, your relationships, your very thoughts existed in a semi-public sphere, constantly vulnerable to observation, judgment, and potential punishment. Perhaps no aspect of daily life better illustrates the profound difference in privacy concepts between feudal Japan and the modern Western world than the surprisingly public nature of bathing, bodily functions, and personal care. Activities that we now consider intensely private were often conducted with minimal separation from others, creating a level of physical intimacy that would be shocking by contemporary standards. Let's begin with bathing, a central aspect of Japanese culture then as now. Unlike the private enclosed bathrooms of modern homes, bathing in feudal Japan was predominantly a communal activity. For most people, the public bathhouse, sento, was the primary venue for cleaning oneself. Imagine entering this steamy, echoing space where men and women, often in separate sections, though mixed bathing was not uncommon in some periods and regions, would wash and soak together in large shared tubs. The bathing process itself was conducted in full view of others. You would sit on a small wooden stool in an open washing area, scrubbing your body while surrounded by neighbors, family members, or complete strangers doing the same. Every blemish, every physical feature was exposed to casual observation. Conversations flowed freely in this environment. The bathhouse served as an important social hub where news was exchanged, gossip shared, and community bonds reinforced. For wealthier households with private bathing facilities, the experience was only marginally more private. The family bath might be used by all household members in succession, often with servants assisting higher status individuals with washing. The physical intimacy between master and servant during these bathing rituals created unusual dynamics where class boundaries temporarily softened, even as hierarchical relationships remained firmly in place. Bodily functions were handled with a similarly matter-of-fact approach that offered minimal privacy. Toilet facilities in most homes were rudimentary, typically a simple pit latrine located in an outbuilding or at the edge of the main structure. These spaces often had only partial partitions or screens, sometimes no more than a half-height divider. The sounds and smells of elimination were difficult to conceal from others nearby. In rural settings, communal toilets might serve several households, creating another shared space where private functions became semi-public activities. Even more public were the roadside toilets available to travelers, often with minimal screening from passers-by. The contents of these toilets, human waste, was considered valuable fertilizer for fields, creating an economic incentive for collection that further reduced any sense of shame or privacy around bodily functions. Personal grooming activities that we now conduct behind locked doors were similarly exposed. Hair washing and styling, teeth cleaning, and other grooming rituals might be performed in common areas of the house or with the assistance of others. For women in particular, elaborate hairstyles required the help of servants or family members, making even this aspect of personal care a shared activity. Menstruation, childbirth, and other intimate female experiences were managed within the communal household environment. While certain taboos existed around these processes, the physical realities were difficult to conceal in a setting where private space was minimal. Menstrual cloths might be washed alongside other household linens, visible to all. Childbirth typically occurred at home with the assistance of female relatives and midwives, often within earshot of other household members. Even sexual intimacy between married couples occurred in this environment of limited privacy. Conjugal relations took place on futon bedding in rooms that might be separated from others only by paper screens, with children or other family members sleeping nearby. The sounds of intimate encounters were difficult to mask completely, creating an awareness of others' sexual lives that would be considered deeply intrusive by modern standards. This lack of physical privacy extended to illness and death as well. The sick were typically tended at home, their symptoms and suffering visible to the entire household. Death and the preparation of the body for funeral rites occurred within the home, making mortality an immediate shared experience rather than something sanitized and hidden away. What's particularly striking about these arrangements is not just their existence, but the matter-of-fact acceptance with which they were treated. The feudal Japanese developed social conventions that created a form of psychological privacy, even when physical privacy was impossible, a collective agreement to grant others a degree of dignity through selective attention and discretion, even while sharing the most intimate aspects of physical existence. The family unit in feudal Japan operated within this environment of minimal privacy, creating domestic dynamics that were fundamentally different from those we recognize today. The constant proximity and visibility of family members to one another shaped relationships, child-rearing practices, conflict resolution, and emotional expression in ways that would seem alien to modern sensibilities. Imagine yourself as a parent in this setting. Your relationship with your children unfolds in full view of the entire household. Disciplining a child, offering comfort, or providing instruction all happen within earshot and often eyesight of others. There is no opportunity to step into a private room for a sensitive conversation or to shield a child from witnessing adult concerns. Children observe adult life in its entirety: work, relationships, conflicts, illness, creating an immersive form of education that modern children rarely experience. The parent-child relationship itself differs significantly from contemporary Western norms. Children in feudal Japanese households typically sleep alongside their parents until a relatively advanced age, sometimes well into what we would consider adolescence. This physical proximity at night creates a different attachment pattern and sense of security, but also means that marital intimacy must be negotiated with extreme discretion, often after children are asleep or in moments of relative privacy snatched during the day. For married couples, maintaining any semblance of a private relationship requires creativity and careful timing. Intimate conversations might occur during walks outside the home or in whispered exchanges late at night. Physical affection is generally restrained, as public displays would be considered improper, and truly private moments are rare. The marriage relationship exists within the broader context of the household and extended family, with individual desires often subordinated to collective needs. Conflicts within the family present particular challenges in this environment. With no private space for heated discussions, disagreements must either be suppressed entirely, conducted through indirect communication, or occasionally erupt in full view of the household. You learn to read subtle cues: a tightened jaw, a slight change in posture, a particular tone of voice, that signal displeasure without explicit confrontation. When conflicts do surface openly, they become community events, sometimes with other family members mediating or intervening. The hierarchical nature of Japanese society extends into the family structure, with clear lines of authority from the household head, typically the eldest male, down through other family members. This hierarchy helps maintain order in a setting where physical boundaries are minimal, creating social barriers that substitute for missing walls. The proper forms of address, specific body language, and ritualized interactions reinforce these invisible boundaries. Emotional life in this environment develops distinctive characteristics. Without the outlet of private emotional expression, individuals often develop sophisticated internal regulation mechanisms. Emotions considered disruptive or inappropriate, excessive anger, jealousy, or even exuberant joy, are modulated carefully. You might notice family members retreating into nature or to a temple for moments of emotional processing that cannot occur within the home. The concept of hon, one's true feelings, versus tatame, the public face one presents, becomes essential in this context. Family members maintain harmony by presenting appropriate tatame within the household while finding limited outlets for hon. This doesn't mean relationships are inauthentic, but rather that they operate within carefully negotiated boundaries that acknowledge the constant presence of others. For women in particular, the lack of privacy creates additional layers of constraint. Female family members often develop subtle communication networks among themselves, creating a form of solidarity and information sharing that operates beneath the surface of male-dominated household structures. Mothers, daughters, sisters, and female servants might exchange significant glances or use coded language to communicate without being fully understood by male household members. Children growing up in this environment develop different expectations around personal space and autonomy than their modern counterparts. They learn early that their actions reflect on the entire family, that individual desires are secondary to group harmony, and that observation by others is a constant reality. Rather than finding this oppressive, many would have considered it normal and even reassuring. The continuous presence of others providing security and belonging, albeit at the cost of what we would now consider personal freedom. This family structure, operating within paper-thin walls and shared spaces, created individuals who were fundamentally social beings, their identities formed in constant reference to others, rather than through private self-discovery. The family unit functioned less as a collection of individuals and more as a single organism, each member playing their role in a tightly choreographed dance of mutual dependence and collective identity. Let's explore more deeply the auditory dimension of this lack of privacy, the constant symphony of sounds that permeated the Japanese feudal household and created an inescapable awareness of others' activities. In a world of paper walls and wooden structures, sound became perhaps the most persistent reminder of your lack of solitude. Close your eyes and imagine the soundscape of a typical household. The morning begins with the subtle rustling of bedding as family members rise from their futons. You can identify each person by their distinctive movements, the quick, energetic motions of children, the measured pace of adults, perhaps the slower, more labored movements of elderly family members. Before anyone speaks, you already know who is awake, who is still sleeping, who might be ill or restless. Conversations flow freely through the house, carried by the thin partitions. You overhear discussions about household finances, plans for the day, minor complaints, and occasional arguments. Even when people attempt to speak quietly, the wooden structure of the house conducts sound efficiently, turning support beams and floor joists into acoustic channels that carry whispers surprising distances. You become adept at determining the emotional state of household members simply by the cadence and volume of their voices, even when you cannot make out specific words. Bodily sounds form an intimate layer of this acoustic environment. The clearing of throats, coughing, sneezing, the sounds of digestion and other physical functions are audible to all. Illness becomes a shared experience as everyone hears the suffering of the sick, their labored breathing, moans of pain, or fitful sleep. Even the most personal bodily functions create sounds that others pretend not to notice, developing what anthropologists call civil inattention, the social practice of tactfully ignoring what cannot be avoided hearing. The preparation of meals creates its own distinctive soundscape. The chopping of vegetables on wooden boards, the scraping of rice from cooking pots, the hiss of water hitting hot surfaces. These domestic sounds mark the rhythm of the day. You can track the progress of meal preparation without seeing it, knowing exactly when food will be ready by the familiar sequence of sounds. Work activities conducted within or near the house contribute their own acoustic signatures. The rhythmic thump of cloth being pounded during laundering, the swish of brooms on tatami mats, the distinctive sounds of various crafts or trades, weaving, woodworking, papermaking, all create an auditory map of the household's productive activities. For artisan families whose living quarters doubled as workshops, these sounds would be particularly dominant. Weather creates another layer of shared auditory experience. Rain drumming on the wooden roof and dripping from eaves. Wind whistling through small gaps in the structure or rattling paper screens. The creak and groan of wooden beams expanding or contracting with temperature changes. The house itself becomes a kind of musical instrument played by the elements, with everyone inside experiencing the performance together. Nighttime brings its own distinctive sounds. The settling of the wooden structure as temperatures cool creates mysterious creaks and pops. The breathing patterns of sleeping family members, occasional snoring, the rustling of bedding as people turn over, all create an intimate nocturnal soundscape. Parents might whisper to each other after children are asleep, but even these hushed conversations must be carefully modulated to avoid waking others or being overheard by still-awake household members. Intimate moments between couples present particular challenges in this acoustic environment. Physical intimacy must be conducted with extreme discretion, with couples developing strategies to minimize sounds that might embarrass them or disturb others. The awareness that others might be listening creates a layer of self-consciousness that shapes even the most private interactions. This constant auditory exposure has profound psychological effects. You develop selective hearing, learning to filter the constant stream of sounds and pay attention only to those relevant to you. You become highly attuned to subtle acoustic cues that might signal mood changes, approaching conflict, or important news. Your sense of self extends beyond your body to include your acoustic presence. How you sound to others becomes an important aspect of your social identity. For those raised in this environment, this acoustic transparency would seem entirely normal. Only when exposed to more private living arrangements would one even recognize it as unusual. The shared soundscape created a form of constant, passive communication that reinforced social bonds and collective awareness, even as it eliminated the possibility of true auditory privacy that modern people take for granted. The night brings no respite from the constant presence of others in feudal Japanese households. Sleep, that most vulnerable of states, occurs in a communal context that would seem profoundly intrusive to modern sensibilities. Let's explore how this shared nocturnal experience shaped both practical habits and psychological patterns. As evening falls, watch the transformation of the household spaces. Rooms that served other functions during the day now become sleeping quarters. Servants or younger family members retrieve futon bedding from storage closets, or shire, unfolding the thin mattresses across the tatami floors. Unlike Western bedrooms with their permanent individual beds, these sleeping arrangements are temporary and communal. Feel the texture of the futon beneath you, a cotton-stuffed mattress perhaps 3 inches thick, offering minimal cushioning against the firm tatami. Your pillow might be a small wooden block with a cushioned roll at the top, designed to accommodate elaborate hairstyles without disturbing them. For commoners, it might be a small bag stuffed with buckwheat hulls. Neither provides the soft comfort modern sleepers expect. The arrangement of bedding follows strict hierarchical principles. The household head typically sleeps in the position of honor, often against the wall with the tokonoma, decorative alcove. Lower status family members and servants arrange their bedding in descending order of importance. In a typical family home, parents and young children might sleep side by side, with older children nearby and servants in adjacent rooms or hallways. The proximity is intimate. Your futon might be placed just inches from others, close enough to hear their breathing, to sense their movements, to smell their bodies. In winter, this closeness provides welcome warmth, as body heat is shared in the poorly insulated rooms. In summer, it becomes another source of discomfort, as multiple bodies generate heat in already sweltering conditions. Privacy for changing clothes is minimal. You might turn your back, use the dim lighting strategically, or perhaps drape a kimono around yourself as a makeshift screen. But the concept of changing in a separate room simply doesn't exist for most. You become adept at discreetly removing and folding your day clothing, slipping into a sleeping yukata with minimal exposure. As darkness settles, the acoustic environment transforms. The household quiets, but doesn't fall silent. The sounds of multiple sleepers create a nocturnal symphony. The deep breathing of the exhausted, the occasional snore, the rustling of bedding as someone turns over, perhaps the soft whimpers of dreaming children. These intimate sounds become so familiar that their absence would be more notable than their presence. Sleep itself is different in this environment. You develop what anthropologists studying traditional Japanese sleep patterns have called segmented awareness, the ability to maintain a level of environmental consciousness even while sleeping. You remain partially alert to the sounds and movements around you, ready to wake if needed, yet able to rest. This is not the deep, isolated sleep prized in modern Western cultures, but a more permeable state that maintains connection to the household even in slumber. For couples seeking intimate moments, the night presents both opportunity and challenge. Physical intimacy must be conducted with extreme discretion, quietly, with minimal movement, often under the cover of darkness and bedding, and with the constant awareness that others are just feet away, possibly awake. The need for silence and restraint shapes these encounters, creating patterns of intimacy very different from those in cultures with private bedrooms. Dreams and nightmares become semi-public experiences. A child crying out from a frightening dream wakes everyone nearby. An adult muttering in their sleep might inadvertently reveal thoughts or concerns they would keep hidden while awake. The boundaries between individual subconscious experiences and shared awareness blur in these communal sleeping spaces. Morning brings another choreographed routine as futon are folded and stored away, transforming sleeping areas back into daytime living spaces. This daily rhythm of transformation, the same space serving multiple functions throughout the day and night, reinforces the fluid, communal nature of the household. This shared sleep experience creates distinctive psychological patterns. You never experience the complete vulnerability of sleeping entirely alone. There is always someone nearby, a source of both security and constraint. The constant presence of others, even in sleep, reinforces the collective identity that defines Japanese feudal society. Your very dreams occur in a shared space. Your unconscious mind never truly separates from the family unit. For those raised in this environment, sleeping alone might actually feel uncomfortable or even frightening, the absence of familiar breathing and presence creating a sense of isolation rather than privacy. The modern Western ideal of the private bedroom would seem not like a luxury, but a strange form of banishment from the comforting proximity of the family group. While the lack of privacy was a universal feature of feudal Japanese life, the degree of exposure varied dramatically across social classes. Privacy, in its limited forms, was a luxury that increased with social status, creating distinct experiences for peasants, merchants, artisans, and samurai families. Let's explore how your position in the rigid social hierarchy determined your access to whatever small measures of seclusion existed. At the bottom of the social ladder, peasant households offered virtually no privacy at all. Imagine yourself in a typical rural farmhouse, a simple, single-room structure with earthen floors and perhaps a raised sleeping platform. The entire family, parents, children, grandparents, live, work, eat and sleep in this single space. There are no partitions, no separate rooms, not even the paper screens found in higher status homes. Every activity occurs in full view of all family members. The physical proximity is constant and unavoidable. These humble dwellings were typically small, perhaps 15 to 20 tatami mats in size, approximately 270-360 square feet, housing extended families of 6 to 10 people. The crowding is intense by modern standards. At night, family members sleep side by side on straw mats, their bodies separated by inches rather than walls. During winter, everyone clusters around the central hearth, irori, sharing warmth, meals, and every aspect of daily existence. For merchant families in towns and cities, slightly more differentiated living arrangements became possible. A typical merchant house might feature a front area for business and a rear living space, with perhaps 2 or 3 rooms separated by fusuma or shoji. This allowed for minimal separation between commercial and family activities, though the divisions remained fluid and permeable to sound. Wealthier merchants might afford larger houses with more distinct areas, including perhaps a reception room for business guests that offered slightly more formality and separation. Artisan households, like those of carpenters, potters, or weavers, typically combined workspace and living quarters in arrangements similar to merchant homes. The constant presence of apprentices and workers created another layer of communal living, with these non-family members often sleeping in workshop areas or small attached quarters. The sounds, smells, and activities of the craft permeated the entire household, with little separation between professional and personal life. For samurai families, the higher one's rank, the greater the possibility of limited privacy. Lower-ranking samurai might live in modest homes similar to wealthy merchants, but higher-ranking warriors could afford more spacious compounds with distinct areas for different functions. A high-ranking samurai residence might include a formal reception area, separate quarters for the lord and lady, spaces for children and servants, and perhaps even a private garden for contemplation. At the very pinnacle of society, daimyo, feudal lords, and their families enjoyed the closest approximation to what we might recognize as privacy. Their castle complexes and mansions featured multiple buildings, substantial gardens, and enough space to create genuine separation between different household members and functions. The daimyo himself might have personal chambers where access was tightly controlled, offering rare moments of solitude. Even here, however, servants were typically present or nearby, and the concept of being truly alone remained foreign. For women across all classes, privacy was particularly constrained, though it varied by status. Peasant women lived their entire lives in the communal gaze of family and village. Higher status women, particularly in samurai households, were subject to stricter seclusion in some respects, often confined to inner chambers of the house, yet this seclusion was communal rather than private, shared with other female family members and servants. The concept of women's quarters, OQ, in elite households represented gender segregation rather than individual privacy. Religious spaces offered occasional respite from constant social exposure. Temples and shrines provided environments where contemplative solitude was possible, if temporary. For elite men, the tea ceremony created another rare opportunity for a form of structured privacy. With the small tea room, typically 4.5 tatami mats, accommodating just a few participants in an atmosphere of focused attention that temporarily suspended normal social dynamics. What's particularly striking about these class distinctions is that even at the highest levels of society, the modern Western concept of privacy remained largely absent. The difference was primarily one of degree rather than kind. More space, more elaborate partitions, more servants to buffer one from unwanted contact, but never the expectation of sustained solitude or freedom from observation that characterizes contemporary notions of privacy. Even the emperor, divine though he was considered, lived within an elaborate court structure that offered ceremonial seclusion, but little true personal privacy. This gradient of exposure across social classes reinforced the hierarchical nature of feudal Japanese society. Limited privacy became another marker of status, another privilege of rank, yet another way in which social position determined every aspect of daily experience. In a world where physical privacy was minimal, the Japanese developed sophisticated psychological adaptations to create inner boundaries where external ones were lacking. These mental and emotional strategies allowed individuals to maintain a sense of self, even while constantly exposed to others' presence. Let's explore the inner landscape that evolved in response to this environment of perpetual visibility. Perhaps the most fundamental adaptation was the development of what anthropologists call situational personhood, the ability to adjust one's behavior, speech, and even apparent thoughts based on the social context. Unlike the Western ideal of a consistent, authentic self that remains the same across different situations, the feudal Japanese self was explicitly contextual, shifting appropriately depending on who was present and what role was required in that moment. This manifested in the concept of hon, true feelings, versus tatami, public face, mentioned earlier. You learn early to maintain a clear distinction between your inner thoughts and emotions, hon, and the socially appropriate expressions and behaviors, tatemi, displayed to others. This isn't perceived as dishonesty or hypocrisy, but as necessary social lubrication that allows the communal machinery to function smoothly. In practical terms, this means developing extraordinary control over facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. You become adept at maintaining a neutral expression while experiencing strong emotions, at speaking in measured tones regardless of inner turmoil, at carrying yourself with appropriate demeanor, even when exhausted or distressed. This bodily discipline creates a kind of portable privacy, a shield of self-containment that offers some protection even when physically exposed. The Japanese language itself evolved to support this psychological privacy through its elaborate system of politeness levels, indirect expression, and contextual meaning. Conversations in feudal households could contain multiple layers of meaning: the literal words spoken, the implications understood by those of similar status, and perhaps deeper meanings grasped only by intimate associates. This linguistic layering allowed for communication that was simultaneously public and private, with certain messages accessible only to those who possessed the proper contextual keys. Another adaptation was the development of mental compartmentalization, the ability to be physically present while maintaining a degree of psychological distance. You might sit among family members, seemingly engaged in the communal activity, while maintaining an inner world of thoughts entirely separate from the external environment. This skill of being present while absent allowed for a form of mental privacy even when physical solitude was impossible. Religious practices offered another avenue for psychological privacy. Meditation techniques taught in Buddhist traditions explicitly cultivated the ability to withdraw attention from external stimuli and focus inward, creating a portable inner sanctuary. Even brief moments of prayer or contemplation could provide psychological respite from constant social exposure. The aesthetic concept of yugen, the suggestion of depth, mystery, and the unknowable, celebrated in poetry and art, reflected this valuing of the hidden inner dimension. The physical environment, while offering minimal barriers, contained subtle features that supported psychological boundaries. The strategic placement of a folding screen, biobu, while not creating true visual or acoustic privacy, could signal a desire for slight separation. The arrangement of one's personal items, the way one oriented one's body in a shared space, even the direction of one's gaze, all became micro-techniques for creating psychological territory within communal areas. For those seeking moments of relative solitude, nature became an important refuge. Gardens, even small ones, offered spaces for contemplation where social demands might temporarily recede. Walking in the forest or along a river provided rare opportunities to experience reduced social scrutiny. These natural settings became associated with the possibility of reconnecting with one's inner self away from the constant performance required within the household. The arts provided another avenue for expressing aspects of the self that might remain hidden in daily life. Poetry, with its elusive, suggestive qualities, allowed for emotional expression that was simultaneously public and private. The tea ceremony created a structured environment where normal social rules were temporarily suspended, allowing for a different kind of presence and interaction. These artistic practices created sanctioned spaces for aspects of the self that might otherwise remain completely submerged. Perhaps most importantly, this environment fostered the development of an inner richness and complexity that served as counterbalance to the constraints of external life. The Japanese aesthetic concepts of mono no aware, the pathos of things, wabi, austere beauty, and sabi, the beauty of age and imperfection, all reflect a profound inner engagement with experience that transcends immediate social circumstances. The cultivation of this inner life became a form of freedom, accessible even within the most constrained external conditions. These psychological adaptations weren't merely coping mechanisms. They shaped a distinctive understanding of selfhood that differed fundamentally from Western conceptions. The self was understood not as an autonomous, bounded entity requiring protection from others, but as an inherently relational being, defined through its connections and appropriate functioning within the social web. Privacy, in this context, wasn't the absence of others, but the ability to maintain inner coherence and appropriate boundaries while remaining fundamentally embedded in the communal fabric. While we've focused primarily on the lack of privacy within the household, this transparency extended well beyond the home's boundaries into the broader community. The village or urban neighborhood in feudal Japan functioned as another layer of surveillance and shared existence that further eroded the concept of private life. Let's explore how community structures reinforced this collective experience. In rural villages, houses were typically clustered closely together with minimal space between structures. Walking through such a settlement, you would notice how the physical proximity creates an environment where neighbors can easily observe each other's comings and goings. The sounds of household activities, arguments, celebrations, daily chores, travel between dwellings, creating a shared acoustic environment that extends beyond individual family units. The agricultural work that dominated rural life occurred in communal settings. Rice paddies, vegetable plots, and other cultivation areas were often adjacent to one another, with farmers working side by side in full view of their neighbors. Even tasks like threshing grain or preparing harvested crops frequently took place in central village areas where everyone could observe. Your work ethic, skill, and productivity were constantly visible to the entire community. Village governance reinforced this transparency. The Goningumi system mentioned earlier bound households together in mutual responsibility units, but the village as a whole also functioned as a collective entity. Village councils, mura yorii, held meetings where community issues were discussed and decisions made, often in the presence of many villagers. Disputes between families might be mediated publicly, with the entire community aware of the conflict and its resolution. Festivals and religious observances created another dimension of communal life. Shinto matsuri, festivals, and Buddhist ceremonies brought the entire village together, with households participating as units rather than as collections of individuals. Your devotion, generosity, and adherence to tradition were displayed publicly during these events, becoming another aspect of your visible social identity. Life transitions that modern people might consider intensely private were community affairs in feudal Japan. Births were attended by village midwives and female relatives, with news spreading quickly throughout the community. Coming-of-age ceremonies were public celebrations. Marriages were arranged through community networks and celebrated with village participation. Deaths brought the community together for funeral rites and memorial observances. Each life stage was witnessed and acknowledged collectively. The physical layout of villages often included communal facilities that necessitated shared experiences. A village well or water source became a gathering place where women collected water, washed clothes, and exchanged information. Communal baths, later developing into public bathhouses in towns, created settings where neighbors saw each other in the most literal state of nakedness. These shared resources reinforced the sense that even bodily needs were met in community contexts, rather than private ones. Information flowed freely through these tightly knit communities. News, rumors, and gossip traveled rapidly, creating what anthropologists call information transparency, the assumption that most things happening within the community would become known to all members. This created powerful incentives for conformity and adherence to social norms, as deviance was difficult to conceal. In urban neighborhoods, machi, similar dynamics operated despite the greater population density. Neighborhoods functioned as semi-autonomous units with their own governance structures, festivals, and collective identity. Merchant and artisan districts developed distinct cultures, but all shared the characteristic of close observation and limited privacy. Urban housing, often arranged in row house configurations, nagaya, featured thin walls and close quarters that made neighbors' lives audible and visible. The consequences of this community transparency were profound. Your reputation, the collective assessment of your character and behavior, became perhaps your most valuable social asset. This reputation wasn't based on carefully curated public appearances, as might be the case in modern social media, but on the community's constant, intimate observation of your daily life. There was little opportunity to present different versions of yourself to different audiences when everyone knew virtually everything about you. This village or neighborhood surveillance created a form of social control more effective than formal law enforcement. The potential shame of community disapproval regulated behavior more powerfully than the distant threat of official punishment. The Japanese concept of the eyes of the village, murahachibu, referred to the practice of community ostracism, being excluded from community life as punishment for serious norm violations, a devastating sanction in a society where individual survival depended on community membership. Yet this transparency also created a powerful sense of belonging and security. The same neighbors who observed your failures also witnessed your successes, shared your griefs, and celebrated your joys. The lack of privacy came with the benefit of never truly being alone in times of hardship. The village or urban neighborhood functioned as an extended family, providing support and assistance based on this intimate knowledge of each member's circumstances. The distinctive architecture of feudal Japanese dwellings wasn't merely an aesthetic choice. It evolved from specific materials, climate adaptations, and cultural values that collectively created an environment where privacy, as we understand it today, was structurally impossible. Let's explore how the very bones and skin of Japanese buildings shaped the experience of shared living. Traditional Japanese architecture developed in response to several key factors. The climate, humid with hot summers and cold winters, demanded buildings that could provide ventilation and cooling during summer months. The frequent seismic activity required flexible structures that could withstand earthquakes. And the available building materials, primarily wood, paper, straw, and clay, dictated certain structural possibilities and limitations. The fundamental building technique that emerged was the post and beam method. Imagine the skeleton of a traditional Japanese house. Vertical wooden posts connected by horizontal beams create the basic framework. This structure supports the heavy tiled or thatched roof, which typically extends well beyond the walls to create deep eaves that protect against rain and sun. Unlike Western buildings with load-bearing walls, Japanese architecture separates the structural elements from the enclosing elements, allowing for flexible, impermanent interior divisions. This separation of structure and enclosure is crucial to understanding the privacy implications. Because interior walls don't need to bear weight, they can be thin, light, and movable. The resulting partitions, shoji and fusuma, are essentially wooden frames covered with paper or fabric. They slide rather than swing, allowing spaces to be reconfigured as needed, but offering minimal visual and acoustic separation. The materials themselves further compromise privacy. Paper, while aesthetically pleasing and effective at diffusing light, is obviously thin and easily damaged. It transmits sound readily and, when backlit, reveals silhouettes clearly. Even the more substantial fusuma panels, typically covered with opaque paper or fabric and decorated with paintings, provide little sound insulation. The wooden structure of the house, with its joinery designed to flex during earthquakes, efficiently conducts sound throughout the building. The flooring material, tatami mats made from woven rush grass over a rice straw core, influences both acoustics and spatial organization. These standardized mats, approximately 3 by 6 feet, determine room sizes and proportions. While they provide comfortable flooring, they also creak and rustle with movement, announcing footsteps and activities. The traditional wood frame flooring beneath the tatami creates another acoustic channel through which sound travels. The relationship between interior and exterior spaces further reduces privacy. Traditional Japanese architecture emphasizes a connection with nature, with entire walls that can open to gardens or verandas. Amado, wooden storm shutters, might close these openings at night or during bad weather, but for much of the year, the boundary between inside and outside remains permeable. This openness, while creating beautiful living spaces with natural ventilation, also exposes household activities to neighbors and passers-by. Heating systems contributed to communal living patterns. The primary heat source in many homes was the irori, a sunken hearth in the floor where a fire burned for cooking and warmth. Family members gathered around this central feature, particularly in winter, creating a focal point for shared activities. Unlike Western fireplaces built into walls, the irori sits in the middle of living space, reinforcing the circular, communal arrangement of household life. Storage solutions reflect and reinforce the fluid use of space. Rather than permanent closets or wardrobes, belongings are kept in chests or in oshiya, storage closets with sliding doors. Bedding is stored during the day, clothing and seasonal items are packed away when not in use, and spaces transform according to need. This system of storage and retrieval means that even personal possessions exist in a more communal context, often visible during the process of access and storage. The toilet facilities in traditional homes were typically located in a small structure, attached to or separate from the main building. These spaces offered slightly more privacy than other household areas, but were still rudimentary by modern standards. Often just a hole over a collection chamber with minimal partitioning. The necessary regular emptying of these chambers, the contents being valuable fertilizer, meant that even this most private function connected to the broader community through the night soil collectors who performed this essential service. Bathing facilities, when they existed within private homes rather than public bathhouses, typically featured wooden tubs that required significant effort to fill and heat. The labor-intensive nature of bath preparation meant that family members would use the same water in succession, another form of intimate sharing that would seem intrusive by contemporary standards. What's particularly fascinating is how this architecture both reflected and reinforced Japanese social values. The flexible, impermanent nature of interior spaces mirrored the Buddhist concepts of impermanence and the Shinto appreciation for natural materials. The visual aesthetics, the play of light through paper screens, the careful framing of garden views, created beauty from constraints. The architecture didn't simply fail to provide privacy, it actively embodied a worldview where the individual was understood primarily as a node within a network of relationships, rather than as an autonomous entity requiring protective boundaries. In an environment where true privacy was structurally impossible, the feudal Japanese developed sophisticated communication strategies to navigate sensitive topics, share confidential information, or express forbidden thoughts and feelings. These techniques created a form of functional privacy within the physically transparent world of paper walls and communal spaces. The Japanese language itself evolved features that facilitated this need for discretion. The highly context-dependent nature of Japanese, with its multiple levels of formality, abundant honorifics, and frequent omission of subjects, allowed for ambiguous communication that could be interpreted differently depending on who was listening. A conversation might contain a surface meaning accessible to all hearers, while conveying additional layers of significance to specific intended recipients who possess the necessary contextual knowledge. Imagine yourself trying to communicate something sensitive to a family member while others are present. You might employ what linguists call veiled speech, using metaphors, allusions to shared experiences, or references to literature or folklore that carry special meaning to your intended recipient, but seem innocuous to others. A simple phrase like, "The plum blossoms are early this year," might, between the right speakers, convey information about a pregnancy, a political development, or a warning of approaching danger. Non-verbal communication became highly developed in this environment. A specific glance, a subtle hand gesture, or a particular way of arranging personal items could transmit messages between those who shared the code. Family members and close associates developed these private languages of gesture and positioning that allowed for communication beneath the surface of public interaction. The positioning of a teacup, the arrangement of chopsticks, or the way a kimono was folded might all carry information invisible to casual observers. Physical spaces, despite their openness, could be strategically used for more private conversations. The veranda and gawa that ran along the exterior of many houses offered a setting where voices could be lowered and partially masked by outdoor sounds. Gardens provided walking paths where conversations could occur at some distance from the house. Even within the home, the strategic timing of discussions, during periods of household noise like cooking or cleaning, or late at night when most were asleep, created pockets of relative auditory privacy. Written communication offered another avenue for privacy in this oral environment. Letters, poems, and notes could be exchanged discreetly, read in private moments, and destroyed or hidden after reading. The Japanese developed elaborate codes and literary allusions that allowed written messages to appear innocent while conveying sensitive content to knowledgeable readers. The physical form of writing itself could carry meaning. The quality of paper, the style of calligraphy, or the inclusion of pressed flowers or other small objects, adding layers of significance beyond the written words. for particularly sensitive matters. Intermediaries often facilitated communication. A trusted servant, friend, or family member might carry verbal messages between parties, allowing for plausible deniability and reducing the risk of being overheard. These human conduits became essential parts of communication networks, especially for romantic relationships or political matters where direct interaction might be impossible or dangerous. Strategic silence became another powerful communication tool. Knowing when not to speak, which topics to avoid in certain company, and how to deflect unwanted conversations were essential skills. The concept of reading the air, kuki wo yomu, understanding the unspoken mood and expectations of a social situation, allowed individuals to navigate potentially dangerous conversational territory without explicit discussion. For romantic communication, particularly during courtship, an elaborate system of indirect expression developed. Poetry exchange became a socially acceptable way for potential partners to communicate feelings that could not be stated directly. The selection of specific seasonal references, classical allusions, or particular imagery created a private language between lovers that might be opaque to others, even if the poems themselves were seen or overheard. Religious contexts sometimes provided opportunities for more open communication. Confessions to Buddhist priests, conversations during pilgrimages, or discussions in temple settings might offer relative freedom to express thoughts that would be risky in household or village contexts. The spiritual realm created a separate space with different rules of disclosure and confidentiality. Perhaps most importantly, the Japanese developed a cultural understanding of when to pretend not to notice, a collective agreement to grant others a semblance of privacy through selective attention. This concept of polite fiction allowed household members to maintain the appearance of ignorance about matters they had inevitably seen or heard, but recognized as intended to be private. This social contract created a form of psychological privacy, even when physical privacy was impossible. These communication strategies weren't merely techniques for occasional secrets. They formed the fabric of daily interaction in a society where the boundaries between public and private were fundamentally different from our own. The ability to navigate these multiple layers of meaning, to speak simultaneously to different audiences, and to discern when to see and when to look away became essential social skills in the transparent world of feudal Japan. The experience of childhood in feudal Japan was profoundly shaped by the lack of privacy that characterized the entire society. Children developed within an environment of constant visibility, their formative years unfolding under the watchful eyes of family members, servants, and the broader community. Let's explore how this transparency affected development, education, and the transition to adulthood. From the moment of birth, a Japanese child entered a world of collective observation. Birth itself typically occurred at home, attended by female relatives, and perhaps a midwife, with the sounds and sometimes sights of labor and delivery experienced by the entire household. The newborn immediately became part of the communal living arrangement, with no separate nursery or children's room to provide isolation. Infants in feudal Japan were rarely left alone. They slept beside their mothers, were carried throughout the day, often strapped to the back of the mother or an older sibling, and remained in constant physical proximity to caregivers. This continuous contact created strong attachment bonds, but also meant that from earliest consciousness, children experienced themselves as perpetually visible to others. As you imagine yourself as a young child in this setting, consider how different your daily experience would be from that of a modern child. You sleep on a futon laid beside your parents, perhaps with siblings nearby. Your cries, babbling, first words, and early movements are all witnessed by multiple family members. Your toilet training occurs without the privacy of a bathroom door, your accidents and successes equally visible to all. Play takes place in communal areas of the house or in village spaces where multiple adults can observe and intervene. The concept of going to your room to play alone simply doesn't exist. There is no such dedicated space. Toys and games are often shared rather than personal possessions, reinforcing the communal nature of childhood experience. Education in feudal Japan, whether formal or informal, occurred in settings that offered little opportunity for private learning or mistakes hidden from view. For common children, practical skills were taught through observation and participation in adult activities, with corrections and guidance provided publicly. A child learning to cook, farm, or practice a craft did so under the watchful eyes of not just parents, but often extended family and community members. For children of samurai or wealthy merchant families, more formal education might take place with tutors or in small schools, but still in settings where performance was visible to others. The practice of reading aloud rather than silently was common, making even intellectual development a partially public process. Mistakes in recitation, calligraphy, or martial arts training were corrected in front of others, creating an educational environment where the fear of public shame became a powerful motivator. Discipline and moral instruction occurred within this transparent context as well. Misbehavior was rarely addressed behind closed doors. Corrections, scolding, and even physical punishment often took place within earshot or sight of other family members. This public nature of discipline reinforced social norms, as children witnessed not only their own correction, but that of siblings and other children, creating a powerful form of observational learning about behavioral boundaries. The emotional life of children developed distinctive characteristics in this environment. Without private spaces to retreat to during moments of strong emotion, children learned early to regulate their feelings in socially acceptable ways. Crying, anger, or excessive excitement might be tolerated briefly in very young children, but was quickly discouraged as they grew older. The ability to maintain appropriate emotional expression, regardless of inner state, became a crucial skill developed through this constant visibility. Particularly interesting is how children's understanding of their bodies and sexuality developed in this context. Young children observed adult bodies during communal bathing, and in the close quarters of daily life, they might witness childbirth, illness, and death firsthand. Sexual development occurred without the modern Western emphasis on bodily privacy and shame, though with clear social rules about appropriate behavior. Adolescents navigated puberty and emerging sexuality within this environment of minimal physical privacy, developing different psychological boundaries than their modern counterparts. The transition to adulthood was marked not by increased privacy, but by greater integration into the adult social and work structures. Coming-of-age ceremonies were public events, celebrating the young person's new status within the community. Marriage, particularly for women, often meant moving into a new household with its own patterns of communal living and observation, not the establishment of a private domestic space. This childhood experience created adults with a fundamentally different relationship to privacy than we might understand today. Having never experienced sustained solitude or freedom from observation, feudal Japanese individuals didn't typically develop the sense that privacy was a right or necessity. Instead, they cultivated sophisticated internal boundaries and social skills that allowed them to function effectively within a perpetually shared existence. The legacy of this childhood experience echoes in Japanese culture even today, where the emphasis on group harmony, awareness of others' needs, and ability to function comfortably in close proximity to others can be traced back to these formative experiences of growing up in a world without doors. Perhaps no aspect of human experience seems to demand privacy more than intimate relationships, yet in feudal Japan, romance, marriage, and sexuality unfolded within the transparent environment we've been exploring. This created patterns of intimacy and relationship dynamics profoundly different from modern Western expectations. Marriage in feudal Japan was primarily a social and economic arrangement rather than a romantic partnership. Matches were typically negotiated between families, with considerations of status, wealth, and alliance taking precedence over personal preference. This pragmatic approach to marriage was well suited to an environment where privacy was minimal. The relationship wasn't predicated on the kind of intimate emotional and physical exclusivity that modern couples might expect. For most couples, courtship in the modern sense barely existed, particularly for arranged marriages. Partners might meet only briefly before the wedding, sometimes not at all. Any premarital interaction occurred under careful supervision, with family members or go-betweens present. The lack of opportunity for private conversation or physical contact meant that couples often entered marriage as virtual strangers, expected to develop their relationship within the communal household setting. Imagine yourself as a newly married couple in this environment. Your wedding night is spent in a room separated from others only by paper screens, perhaps with a specially arranged, slightly more secluded sleeping area, but still within a house where every sound carries. Family members and servants are aware of this significant transition, creating an atmosphere where this most intimate of moments occurs within a context of collective awareness, if not direct observation. As the marriage continues, physical intimacy must be negotiated within these same constraints. Sexual relations typically occur at night, after others are asleep, with great emphasis on silence and discretion. The futon bedding itself offers minimal sound insulation against the tatami mats below. The need for extreme quietness shapes the physical expression of intimacy, creating patterns of restraint and control that become habitual. For women, particularly in samurai households, marriage often meant moving into the husband's family home, where they would be under the constant observation of not just their new husband, but his parents, especially the mother-in-law, siblings, and household servants. This scrutiny extended to the most intimate aspects of the relationship, including fertility and childbearing. A new wife's menstrual cycles might be tracked by female household members, her potential pregnancy closely monitored, and her success or failure in producing children, especially sons, a matter of family concern rather than private experience. The physical arrangement of sleeping quarters reinforced the communal nature of even married life. Children often slept in the same room as parents until well into childhood. In wealthy households with more rooms, married couples might have slightly more separated sleeping arrangements, but servants were typically nearby, and the thin partitions offered minimal acoustic privacy. For common families in single-room dwellings, couples slept alongside extended family members, with perhaps only a strategic positioning of screens, offering token separation. Expressions of affection between spouses were typically restrained in this environment. Public displays of romantic attachment were considered inappropriate, and even within the household, overtly affectionate behavior might be limited. The emotional dimension of marriage often developed through subtle interactions, shared responsibilities, and mutual respect, rather than demonstrative romance. The Japanese concept of skinship, the non-sexual physical proximity that creates bonding, became important in relationships where verbal and explicit emotional expression was constrained. For those seeking romance outside of marriage, whether unmarried youth, married individuals in unsatisfying arrangements, or widowed persons, the challenges were even greater. Illicit relationships required elaborate strategies to create even moments of relative privacy. Lovers might meet in remote natural settings, arrange encounters during festivals or market days when community attention was diverted, or rely on trusted intermediaries to exchange messages and gifts. The risks were substantial, as discovery could lead to severe social consequences, particularly for women. The literature and art of the period reflect these constraints and the creativity they inspired. The tale of Genji and other court romances describe elaborate schemes for secret meetings, the exchange of poems as coded communication, and the use of intermediaries to facilitate relationships. These weren't merely literary devices, but reflected the actual strategies employed by those seeking romantic or sexual connections in a world where privacy was structurally impossible. Interestingly, while physical and emotional privacy was minimal, sexual knowledge itself was not as rigidly segregated from children as in later Western societies. Children in feudal Japanese households would have awareness of adult sexuality through the sounds and glimpses inevitable in shared living spaces. This created a different relationship to sexual development, less shrouded in mystery and prohibition, though still governed by clear social rules about appropriate behavior and timing. The psychological impact of this transparent intimacy created relationship patterns distinct from modern expectations. Couples developed non-verbal communication systems, learned to interpret the subtlest cues from their partners, and built connections that functioned within the constraints of communal living. The relationship existed not as a private island, but as a visible thread within the broader tapestry of family and community life. less intensely exclusive perhaps, but often deeply integrated into the social fabric that sustained it. The experience of privacy in feudal Japan was further complicated by the seasonal extremes of the Japanese climate and how traditional architecture responded to these conditions. The same paper walls and flexible spaces that created acoustic and visual transparency also meant that inhabitants were intimately exposed to the elements, creating another dimension of vulnerability and shared experience. Imagine yourself in a traditional Japanese house during the height of summer. The humid heat is oppressive, and the architecture responds by opening up completely. Exterior shoji screens are removed entirely, leaving the house open to any passing breeze, and to the eyes of neighbors or passers-by. Interior partitions might also be removed or left open to maximize air circulation. The boundary between inside and outside blurs significantly, with household activities visible from the street and natural sounds flowing unimpeded into the home. Feel the sweat trickling down your back as you try to find relief from the heat. Clothing is minimized, perhaps just a light yukata robe, exposing more of the body than would be typical in cooler seasons. Family members might dampen cloths with cool water and place them on their skin, fan themselves or each other, or move to the engawa, veranda, seeking slightly cooler air. These heat mitigation strategies all occur in full view of the household, creating a shared experience of discomfort and adaptation. The sounds of summer create another layer of sensory intrusion. Cicadas buzz incessantly, their droning penetrating every corner of the house. Frogs croak from nearby rice paddies or garden ponds. Neighbors' conversations, children playing, and the activities of the community become part of your soundscape, as the open house offers no acoustic barrier. At night, the whine of mosquitoes becomes a persistent companion, with the insects freely entering the open dwelling. Winter brings the opposite challenge, but similar privacy implications. As temperatures drop, the house closes up, with wooden storm shutters, amado, added to exterior openings. While this creates more visual privacy from the outside world, it also means that family members are confined in closer proximity, with even fewer opportunities to find separate spaces. The cold permeates the thin walls, driving everyone to cluster around the irori, hearth, or gather under the kotatsu, a low table with a heat source underneath and a heavy blanket to trap warmth. Feel the biting cold of a winter morning as you emerge from under the heavy futon bedding. Your breath forms visible clouds in the unheated air. The rush to dress in multiple layers of clothing happens quickly and with minimal privacy. Trips to the cold, often outdoor toilet become dreaded necessities. Bathing becomes less frequent due to the discomfort of exposure to cold air, creating a more pungent human environment as body odors accumulate and mingle in the enclosed space. The rainy season, tsuyu, creates its own distinctive environment. Continuous rainfall drums on the roof, creating a constant background soundtrack. Humidity rises, causing paper screens to absorb moisture and become even more fragile and translucent. Mold and mildew might develop on surfaces, their musty smell permeating the house. Laundry must be dried inside, adding to the damp atmosphere and cluttering the already limited space with hanging garments. Seasonal transitions necessitate changes to the house itself, activities that become communal projects. In spring and fall, paper screens might be replaced or repaired, with family members working together to stretch new paper over wooden frames. Seasonal bedding, clothing, and household items are retrieved from storage or packed away, a process visible to all and often requiring the coordination of multiple household members. The sensory experience of weather becomes intimately shared. The sound of rain on the roof, the whistle of wind through small gaps in the structure, the creak and groan of wooden elements expanding or contracting with temperature changes. These create a collective auditory experience that all household members participate in simultaneously. The smell of wet earth after rain, the fragrance of seasonal blossoms, or the smoke from heating fires all permeate the house without barrier. Natural disasters, particularly common in Japan, create moments of extreme shared vulnerability. During earthquakes, typhoons, or floods, the flimsy partitions offer minimal protection. and family members experience the danger collectively, often huddled together in the safest available space. The aftermath, repairs to damaged screens, cleaning up water intrusion, or temporarily modifying living arrangements, becomes another communal activity conducted in full view of all. This seasonal exposure created a relationship with nature and weather fundamentally different from that experienced in more insulated Western dwellings. The Japanese developed a heightened awareness of seasonal changes, an aesthetic appreciation for natural phenomena, captured in seasonal poetry and art, and practical adaptations to environmental conditions that were necessarily shared rather than individualized. The seasonal opening and closing of the house also affected social patterns. Summer created more interaction with neighbors and community as activities spilled outdoors and houses opened up. Winter drove people into closer proximity within the household, while potentially reducing broader community contact. These cyclical changes in privacy and exposure became integrated into the rhythm of social life, creating seasonal variations in how the balance between individual and collective experience was negotiated. In modern societies, illness and death are often privatized experiences, hidden behind hospital doors or managed by specialized professionals. In feudal Japan, however, these fundamental human experiences occurred within the transparent household environment, making suffering, mortality, and grief communal rather than private affairs. When illness struck a household member, there was no separate sick room where they could recover in isolation. The ill person typically remained within the main living space, their symptoms, discomfort, and treatment visible to the entire household. Imagine yourself falling ill with a fever in this setting. Your flushed face, labored breathing, and pained expressions are observed by family members of all ages. Your moans or cries of pain travel through the thin partitions, announcing your suffering throughout the house. Treatment itself was a public process. Family members would prepare and administer herbal remedies, apply compresses, or assist with bodily functions when necessary. These caregiving activities occurred in view of others, with multiple household members, often participating or observing. For serious illnesses, a healer might be summoned, perhaps a Buddhist monk with medical knowledge, a Shinto practitioner, or a local expert in traditional medicine. Their examination and treatment would typically occur in the presence of family members, their diagnosis and prognosis discussed openly. Children in the household witnessed illness firsthand, observing its progression, treatment, and resolution, or failure to resolve. This created a fundamentally different relationship to sickness than in societies where children are shielded from such realities. Young people learned about human vulnerability and mortality through direct observation rather than abstract explanation, developing both practical caregiving skills and emotional frameworks for understanding suffering. Chronic conditions created a permanent state of visible disability or discomfort. An elderly family member with joint pain, a child with a congenital condition, or someone suffering from long-term illness became part of the household landscape, their limitations and needs integrated into daily life rather than segregated. Accommodations for their condition were negotiated within the shared space, affecting everyone's routines and activities. Death, when it came, was similarly embedded in the household context. Most people died at home, their final hours witnessed by family members. Feel the weight of this intimate exposure to mortality, the labored breathing of the dying person, the gradual slackening of facial muscles, the final stillness of death occurring within the communal living space. Unlike the modern Western experience where death is often medicalized and removed from daily life, feudal Japanese families experienced death as an immediate sensory reality. After death, the body remained in the house for a period of ritual preparation. Family members, sometimes assisted by community members with specialized knowledge, would wash and prepare the corpse for funeral rites. This intimate handling of the dead occurred within the household, often in the same space where daily activities had taken place. The sounds of mourning, weeping, chanting, or ritual expressions of grief permeated the house, unavoidable to all inhabitants. Buddhist funeral practices brought monks into the home for sutra recitation and rituals. Neighbors and community members would visit to pay respects, creating a flow of people through the household during this vulnerable time. The deceased might be laid out in the main room, transformed temporarily into a sacred space but still within the physical heart of the home. Cremation or burial would eventually remove the physical remains, but the spiritual presence of the deceased remained within the household through the Butsudan, Buddhist altar, where memorial tablets were kept. Regular rituals of remembrance, offering incense, food, or prayers, integrated the dead into ongoing family life. These ancestral presences were understood to observe and participate in family affairs, creating another layer of witnessed existence that extended beyond physical life. Grief, like the illness and death that preceded it, unfolded in this transparent environment. There were few opportunities to mourn in private. Tears, emotional outbursts, or the quieter manifestations of grief occurred within the communal space. While certain ritual periods allowed for more explicit expressions of sorrow, the return to daily activities happened within the same physical environment where the loss had occurred, with constant reminders and associations. This public experience of illness, death, and grief created distinctive psychological and social patterns. The Japanese developed nuanced approaches to acknowledging suffering without excessive focus, a form of compassionate awareness that neither ignored pain nor dramatized it. The visible nature of these experiences fostered practical knowledge about caregiving, dying, and mourning that was transmitted through direct observation rather than formal instruction. Perhaps most significantly, this transparency around mortality integrated death into the fabric of living in ways that many modern societies have lost. Death was not a hidden, mysterious event, but a visible part of the human life cycle, witnessed from childhood and understood as inevitable. This created both a greater familiarity with mortality and sophisticated cultural practices for making meaning of death within the continuing life of the family and community. The shared experience of illness and death also reinforced social bonds, as caregiving created interdependencies and collective memories. The household moved through these difficult passages together, their responses visible to one another, creating a shared emotional history that bound them together through witnessed vulnerability. The growing merchant class of feudal Japan experienced unique privacy challenges, as their homes often doubled as places of business. This dual-purpose environment created distinctive patterns of exposure and observation that differed from both rural farmhouses and samurai residences. Let's explore how commerce and domestic life intertwined in these urban settings, further complicating the already limited concept of privacy. The typical merchant's home in a town or city was structured with the front portion facing the street serving as the shop or business area, mais, while the rear contained the living quarters, zashiki. Imagine yourself in such a dwelling, where the boundary between public commercial space and family living space was fluid and permeable. The mise typically had wide entrances that could be completely opened during business hours, exposing the interior to the street and allowing customers to see directly into the working area of the house. During business hours, customers, suppliers, apprentices, and workers moved freely through the front portion of the house. They might sit on the raised floor at the edge of the shop area to conduct transactions, their voices carrying into the living quarters behind. Family members, including women and children who might otherwise have less contact with outsiders, regularly interacted with these visitors, their behavior and appearance subject to public scrutiny that reinforced the family's commercial reputation. The physical separation between business and living areas was often minimal, perhaps a single sliding partition that remained open during the day for practical purposes. Even when closed, these dividers provided little sound insulation. Conversations about family matters might be overheard by customers or employees, while business discussions were audible to all household members. Financial concerns, commercial secrets, and family issues became intertwined in this acoustically transparent environment. For merchants dealing with valuable goods, security concerns created another layer of surveillance. Apprentices and workers often slept in the shop area to guard merchandise, their presence a constant feature of the household. The family's movements, particularly around valuable inventory or money boxes, were observed by these employees, creating a system of mutual monitoring where the employers watched the workers and were themselves watched in return. Account books, commercial correspondence, and financial records were typically kept within the household, often in chests or cabinets that might be locked but remained within the shared living space. Family members, including children, would be aware of business transactions, financial status, and commercial relationships simply through proximity and observation. This created a form of financial transparency within the family unit that contrasts sharply with modern separation of business and personal finances. Meals often served dual purposes in merchant households. A family meal might transform into a business meeting if clients or suppliers were present. The preparation and consumption of food became another visible performance, with the quality and abundance of meals sending signals about the family's prosperity and generosity. Even this most basic domestic activity acquired commercial implications in the merchant's home. Apprentices in merchant households occupied an interesting intermediate position between family and employee. They typically lived with the merchant family, often for years of training, sharing meals and sleeping spaces. These young people were simultaneously insiders who observed the intimate details of family life, and outsiders whose presence required family members to maintain appropriate behavior and decorum at all times. Their integration into the household created another layer of constant observation. Urban density added yet another dimension to this exposure. Merchant houses in commercial districts were typically built side by side with minimal space between structures. The sounds of neighboring businesses and households filtered through thin walls. In multi-story townhouses, machia, different businesses or families might occupy different floors, creating vertical as well as horizontal proximity. The urban soundscape, street vendors calling their wares, customers haggling, neighbors arguing or celebrating, formed a constant auditory backdrop that penetrated the merchant's home. For wealthy merchants who achieved significant success, the acquisition of larger homes with more distinct separation between business and living areas became possible. These more substantial urban residences might include interior gardens or courtyards that provided slightly more secluded areas for family activities. Yet even these improved dwellings maintained the fundamental pattern of integrated commercial and domestic space, with employees, customers, and family members sharing the overall environment. The merchant's wife occupied a particularly visible position in this setting. Unlike samurai women who might be more secluded in interior rooms, merchant wives often participated actively in the business, keeping accounts, supervising employees, or directly serving customers. This commercial role placed them in regular contact with people outside the family, making their behavior, appearance, and competence subject to public evaluation that directly affected the family's business reputation. This integration of commerce and domestic life created a distinctive psychological environment. Merchant families developed a heightened awareness of how their private behaviors might impact their public reputation and commercial success. The performance of respectability, reliability, and prosperity became a constant requirement, with few opportunities to relax this vigilance even within the home. The merchant's dwelling embodied the reality that in feudal Japan, one's livelihood and one's private life were not separate spheres, but aspects of a single, visible existence under constant community observation. Let's now explore how children grew up in this environment of constant exposure and how it shaped their personalities from the earliest years of life. Imagine yourself as a child born into a feudal Japanese household, where the concept of a children's room simply doesn't exist. From the moment of your birth, you are immersed in a world of constant observation and shared existence. Your birth itself occurs in the communal space of the house, attended by midwives and female family members, with the sounds of labor audible to all household members. Your first cries echo through the thin walls, announcing your arrival not just to your immediate family, but to neighbors and servants. Your mother has no truly private moment to recover or to establish an exclusive bond with you. Other eyes and ears are always present. As you grow, you sleep beside your parents, perhaps between them or near siblings and other relatives. Your sleep is lulled by the sounds of familiar breathing, by the nighttime movements of adults, by the whispered conversations that occur when they believe you are sleeping. You learn to sleep through distractions, to maintain a state of semi-consciousness that is simultaneously deep enough to rest, but alert enough to respond when necessary. Your earliest lessons come not from explicit instruction, but from constant observation. You witness all aspects of adult life: work, conflict, reconciliation, illness, intimacy, though discreetly conducted, creating an intuitive understanding of social behavior that modern children, segregated in child-specific spaces, rarely develop. There are no adult conversations from which you are excluded. Instead, you learn to interpret nuances, to understand when to pretend not to hear, to develop what the Japanese call mimi o fusagu, the act of metaphorically closing one's ears, even when physically impossible. Your emotional education is equally shaped by this transparency. You rarely see uncontrolled emotional outbursts, as the adults around you have learned to modulate their expressions. Instead, you become extraordinarily attuned to subtle cues: a slight tension in the voice, a momentary pause, a shift in posture, that reveal true emotional states behind controlled expressions. This sophisticated emotional literacy develops as a direct response to the lack of privacy. Play takes different forms in this environment. Your toys are few and often shared. Your play occurs in communal spaces, observed and occasionally directed by adults. There is no modern concept of playtime as a separate, protected activity. Instead, your play intertwines with the productive activities of the household. You might play with straw dolls while adults prepare meals, or practice wooden sword movements while men discuss business nearby. As you approach adolescence, you begin to feel more acutely the limitations of this environment. The awakening of bodily awareness and the first impulses of individuality collide with the reality of constant exposure. You develop techniques for creating small pockets of psychological privacy, perhaps finding a corner of the garden where you can sit alone for a few moments, or learning to withdraw mentally to an inner space while physically present with others. For girls, the transition to adulthood brings particular challenges. Bodily changes occur under watchful eyes. Menstruation, managed with cotton cloths that need to be washed and dried, becomes common knowledge in the household. Lessons about appropriate female behavior are transmitted not just through direct instruction, but through constant observation and correction by older women of the family and servants. For boys, adolescence often brings an expansion of the physical world, perhaps learning a trade or martial training that takes them outside the house. But even these external environments operate under similar principles of hierarchical observation and collective responsibility. A young apprentice lives under the constant gaze of his master, often residing in his household under the same conditions of forced proximity. This upbringing in an environment of total transparency produces adults fundamentally different from those raised with modern expectations of privacy. You develop a sense of self that is inherently relational, defined not by a private interiority, but by your appropriate functioning within the social web. Your identity is inseparable from your family and social roles, creating a form of existence that many modern Westerners would find suffocating, but which for you is simply the natural reality of human life. Let's now consider how this lack of privacy affected the most significant moments of adult life, particularly the rituals and ceremonies that marked important transitions. These events, which in modern societies often balance public and private elements, existed in feudal Japan almost entirely in the communal sphere. Marriage, perhaps the most significant transition in adult life, was fundamentally an agreement between families, not individuals. The bride and groom often knew each other only superficially before the ceremony, having been introduced in formal arranged meetings, miai, where they were always accompanied by family members. The ceremony itself was a public event, witnessed not just by immediate family, but often by the entire village community or urban neighborhood. More revealing, however, was the wedding night. In many households, especially among the lower classes, newlyweds did not enjoy a private bedroom. Instead, their futon might be placed in a corner of the communal space, perhaps with a folding screen, biobu, offering a symbolic illusion of privacy, but little real acoustic isolation. The consummation of marriage occurred with the tacit knowledge of everyone in the house, a rite of passage indirectly witnessed, but unequivocally present in the collective consciousness. For women, pregnancy brought another dimension of bodily exposure. Your changing body was openly observed and commented upon. Advice, restrictions, and traditional practices were imposed by the female community of the household. Labor, as mentioned earlier, occurred in the domestic space, with the sounds of birth permeating the entire structure. There was no isolated delivery room, no sterilized private medical experience, just the visceral, audible, shared event. Illness, similarly, was a communal experience. Imagine yourself bedridden with fever, your futon laid out in the same space where family life continues around you. Your groans of discomfort, your labored breathing, your moments of delirium, all are witnessed. Your body is tended by various family members, washed and cleaned without the modern expectation of medical modesty. The recovery or deterioration of your condition is collectively monitored, each improvement or relapse noted and discussed. Death completed this cycle of exposure. The dying rarely faced their final moments in isolation. Family gathered, witnessing the last breaths, the cessation of breathing. The body was prepared for funeral in the home itself, washed and dressed by family members. Mourning, though governed by strict conventions of decorum, occurred in a communal context where expressions of grief, however restrained, were inevitably observed. Even moments of achievement and celebration existed primarily as shared experiences. Imagine an artisan completing a particularly fine piece. His pride is immediately tempered by awareness of how others will perceive his work. A farmer's joy at an abundant harvest is inseparable from the communal recognition of this success. There is no private moment of personal satisfaction, only satisfaction that is simultaneously personal and public. This constant transparency created a distinctive form of social consciousness that the Japanese call seiken, a term that might be roughly translated as the social world or the eyes of society. Seiken is not just an external audience, but an internalized presence, the constant awareness of how your actions are perceived by others. This awareness becomes so deeply embedded that it functions even in the absence of physical observers. Consider how this awareness shaped even your most intimate thoughts. In the relative privacy of your mind, you still formulated ideas with an awareness of how they would be received if expressed. Your desires, ambitions, and resentments were filtered through this social lens even before they reached conscious expression. The self that you experienced internally was already a social product, shaped by this perpetual exposure. For the few who occupied positions of power, feudal lords, high-ranking priests, exceptionally wealthy merchants, there existed slightly greater degrees of physical separation. A daimyo, feudal lord, might command more isolated quarters within his castle, with layers of servants and protocols creating barriers between him and the outside world. Yet, even these powerful individuals lived under constant observation, from servants who were never far away, from advisors monitoring their decisions, from rivals looking for signs of weakness. This gradation of privacy reinforced social hierarchies. The ability to command space, to control access to your body and words, became a marker of status. The lower your social position, the more exposed your existence. The ETA, outcasts, at the bottom of the social hierarchy, often lived in conditions of extreme exposure, their homes and lives open to constant scrutiny from those above them. Thus, privacy in feudal Japan was not just physically limited, but socially structured, a privilege unequally distributed that reflected and reinforced the class divisions that define society. Your right to physical separation, to control over who could see or hear you, corresponded directly to your place in the hierarchical order of the world. As we reflect on this life of constant exposure, it's natural to wonder, how did people find moments of true inner peace in this environment? What spaces, physical or psychological, offered some relief from this perpetual transparency? Let's explore the rare refuges available in feudal Japan and how they shaped a distinctive understanding of tranquility and interiority. Nature offered perhaps the most accessible escape. Walking alone on a forest path, sitting beside a stream, or contemplating the moon from a silent garden. These moments provided brief intervals from constant observation. It's no coincidence that nature appreciation developed as a refined art form in feudal Japan. What for us today might seem merely aesthetic was, for many, a psychological necessity, a rare breathing space in a life of incessant exposure. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines also offered forms of refuge. Meditation, in particular, provided a type of inner privacy even when practiced in communal settings. By turning attention to the breath, to bodily sensations, to the emptiness of mind, the practitioner created an internal space inaccessible to external gazes. This practice of disciplined interiority became an essential skill for those seeking some form of psychological autonomy. The arts served a similar function. Imagine a poet composing a haiku, seemingly absorbed in contemplation of a cherry blossom or the autumn moon. Externally, he participates in communal life. Internally, he inhabits a space of personal creation. Calligraphy, painting, the tea ceremony, all these practices created states of concentration that allowed a form of privacy in plain sight, an inner withdrawal that coexisted with physical presence in shared space. For women, particularly limited in their social mobility, diary writing became a significant refuge. The Sarashina diary and the Diary of Lady Murasaki exemplify how court women of the Heian period created spaces of personal reflection through writing. Even if these texts might eventually be discovered by others, the act of writing itself offered moments of self-expression rarely available in everyday social interaction. Curiously, even deep sleep acquired special value in this context. Those moments of unconsciousness represented perhaps the only state in which one was truly inaccessible to social scrutiny, though even then, your sleeping body remained visible and audible to others. Dreams became a last bastion of truly private experience, an inner world that, no matter how transparent your waking life, remained your secret. As our journey through this world of paper walls and intertwined lives comes to an end, perhaps we can more deeply appreciate the quiet luxury of privacy that many of us enjoy today. As you settle into your bed, in your room, perhaps with a door that can be closed and locked, consider how this simple physical barrier represents a freedom that would have been almost unimaginable to our feudal Japanese ancestors. As you close your eyes tonight, I invite you to feel the tranquility of this private space that envelops your sleep. Feel the privilege of falling asleep without watching eyes, of breathing at the rhythm your body naturally chooses, of moving and adjusting without awareness of creating sounds that others might hear. This nocturnal solitude, this cocoon of privacy that wraps your rest, is a relatively recent historical luxury. Perhaps paradoxically, this story of perpetually exposed lives might deepen your appreciation for the silence and separation that envelop your sleep now. As you drift toward unconsciousness, imagine the generations who fell asleep to the sound of others breathing, who never knew the experience of a truly private room, who navigated the dream world from a fundamentally different starting point than your own. If this exploration of the lack of privacy in feudal Japan has helped lull you to sleep, consider joining us again on our next journey through the sleep-inducing curiosities of history. Perhaps you'd like to leave a comment sharing how this journey has affected your own thoughts about privacy, or suggest other historical topics you'd like us to explore together. Each era has its own rhythms of sleep and wakefulness, its own conceptions of what is public and private, and there are endless sleep-inducing stories waiting to be told. Until then, allow the paper walls of feudal Japan to dissolve into your dreams. Let the soft rustling of tatami mats blend with your increasingly deep breathing. Let the awareness of watching eyes fade as you slide into your own private space of rest. Oyasumi nasai. Good night, and may your dreams be as expansive and free as the sky above those ancient Japanese houses, where generations lived, loved, and dreamed under the same roof, separated only by paper and convention, united by the shared human experience that transcends all barriers, physical or temporal. Sleep well. Dream deeply, and remember that as you navigate the dream world tonight, you carry with you not just your own consciousness, but echoes of those who came before. those who fell asleep under the soft glow of lanterns filtering through paper walls, lulled by the knowledge that, even in sleep, they were never truly alone.